Have you ever wondered why God chose to completely obliterate the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah? What could have been so severe, so unforgivable, that it led to their utter destruction by fire and brimstone from the heavens? Was it just one specific sin, or were there deeper, more insidious actions that brought about this divine judgment? Sodom and Gomorrah are often referenced in discussions about morality, but the truth is, the story carries more profound lessons than most realize. What were these cities really guilty of? Were their transgressions limited to the commonly cited sins, or is there more to the story than we've been led to believe? And most importantly, do those same sins still plague our world today? In this video, we'll explore 5 unforgivable sins that led to the downfall of these infamous cities. But be warned, what you discover may challenge your perceptions and even raise questions about the moral state of our own society. Make sure to watch until the end, because understanding the full story behind Sodom and Gomorrah could reveal unsettling parallels to our modern world. Let's dive in and uncover the truth together. Part 1. Introduction. The story of Sodom and Gomorrah. Sodom and Gomorrah, 2 cities whose names have echoed through millennia as symbols of sin and divine retribution. But beyond the surface-level associations, what do we truly know about these ancient cities? What historical and biblical evidence reveals the reasons for their complete destruction by God? To fully understand, we must delve deeper into their stories as recorded in the Bible, shedding light on what made these places so notorious that they were obliterated in one catastrophic act of divine wrath. The story of Sodom and Gomorrah is primarily found in the book of Genesis, chapters 18 and 19. These cities were part of a prosperous region known as the Plains of Jordan, located near what is believed to be the area surrounding the modern-day Dead Sea. The cities were situated in a fertile valley that was described as being well-watered, like the Garden of the Lord, Genesis 13 verse 10. This lush environment made Sodom and Gomorrah centers of commerce and trade, attracting people from all walks of life. However, this prosperity also became the breeding ground for moral decay and unrestrained indulgence. The story begins with Abraham, the patriarch chosen by God, who was living on the plains of Mamre. In Genesis 18 verses 20 to 21, God reveals his intention to Abraham, saying, "The outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is so great and their sin so grievous that I will go down and see if what they have done is as bad as the outcry that has reached me." This outcry was not just a whisper, but a collective cry from those oppressed and victimized by the evil deeds taking place in these cities. As God reveals his plans to destroy the cities, Abraham enters into a desperate plea with the Lord. Knowing that his nephew Lot lived in Sodom, Abraham boldly questions God's decision. "Will you indeed sweep away the righteous with the wicked? Suppose there are 50 righteous people in the city. Will you really sweep it away and not spare the place for the sake of the 50 righteous people in it?" Genesis 18 verses 23 to 24. In a remarkable exchange, Abraham continues to negotiate with God, gradually lowering the number, asking, "What if only 40, or 30, or even 10 righteous people can be found?" God finally responds, "For the sake of 10, I will not destroy it." Genesis 18 verse 32. Yet, despite Abraham's intercession, not even 10 righteous souls could be found within Sodom. As the narrative shifts to Genesis 19, 2 angels are sent by God to confirm the depths of the city's wickedness. They arrive in the evening, where they encounter Lot, who is sitting at the city gate, a position that suggests he was a man of some standing in Sodom. Lot, recognizing the strangers as divine messengers, insists on providing them shelter for the night, despite their initial reluctance. "Please, my lords," Lot implores, "turn aside to your servant's house. You can wash your feet and spend the night, and then go on your way early in the morning." Genesis 19 verse 2. The true nature of Sodom's inhabitants is soon revealed when the men of the city, young and old, from every part of the city, gather around Lot's house. They demand, Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us so that we can have sex with them. Genesis 19 verses 4-5. This brazen demand was not merely an act of lust, but a display of violent intent, demonstrating the depth of moral corruption. In ancient cultures, hospitality was considered sacred, and to mistreat guests was one of the gravest offenses. Here, the men of Sodom sought to assault those under Lot's protection, violating every principle of decency. Lot, desperate to protect his guests, even offers a shocking proposal. "Look, I have 2 daughters who have never slept with a man. Let me bring them out to you, and you can do what you like with them. But don't do anything to these men, for they have come under the protection of my roof." Genesis 19 verse 8. This desperate attempt by Lot to shield his guests, even at the cost of his own family, reveals the dire circumstances and the depravity that had engulfed the city. But the crowd was relentless. The angels, seeing that the situation had escalated beyond control, strike the men with blindness, rendering them unable to find the door. At dawn, the angels deliver a final, urgent warning to Lot. "Flee for your lives. Don't look back, and don't stop anywhere in the plain. Flee to the mountains, or you will be swept away." Genesis 19 verse 17. Lot hesitates, but the angels grasp his hand and the hands of his wife and daughters, leading them out of the city. As they escape, fire and sulfur rain down from the heavens, consuming Sodom, Gomorrah, and everything within them. Even Lot's wife, who looked back despite the angel's warning, is turned into a pillar of salt, a stark reminder of the consequences of longing for a life steeped in sin. The total destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah was swift and absolute. The cities that once thrived in the fertile plains were reduced to smoldering ruins. The Bible describes it as a scene of utter devastation. Early the next morning, Abraham got up and returned to the place where he had stood before the Lord. He looked down toward Sodom and Gomorrah, toward all the land of the plain, and he saw dense smoke rising from the land, like smoke from a furnace. Genesis 19 verses 27-28. In that moment, everything that had once symbolized prosperity was reduced to ashes. The question remains, what were the specific sins so grievous that they provoked such extreme divine wrath? The full exploration of these 5 sins, wickedness, sexual immorality, idolatry, pride, and neglect of the poor, will be the focus of the next section, where we will dive deep into the moral and spiritual corruption that led to the city's fiery end. Let's continue this journey as we unravel the 5 unforgivable sins that sealed the fate of Sodom and Gomorrah. Part 2. The 5 sins of Sodom and Gomorrah. The first sin, wickedness and violence. 2.1. Wickedness and violence. The first and most prominent sin that led to the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah was the overwhelming presence of wickedness and violence. These cities were notorious for their cruelty and lack of compassion, turning what were once prosperous and thriving communities into places where justice and morality had completely eroded. According to the book of Genesis, the outcry from these cities reached God due to the intense suffering of those who had been oppressed or mistreated. In Genesis 18 verse 20, it is written, "Then the Lord said, The outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is so great and their sin so grievous that I will go down and see if what they have done is as bad as the outcry that has reached me." This outcry indicates that the actions of the inhabitants were not just personal failings but had created widespread harm, impacting those who were vulnerable in the society. The story continues as God sends 2 angels to the city of Sodom to see for themselves the extent of the wickedness. Upon their arrival, they are greeted by Lot, Abraham's nephew, who urgently insists they stay at his home for the night to protect them from the dangers of the city. Genesis 19 verse 2 recounts Lot's plea. "Please, my lords, turn aside to your servant's house. You can wash your feet and spend the night, and then go on your way early in the morning." This act of hospitality was significant because, In the culture of the time, welcoming strangers into one's home was not just a courtesy, it was a sacred duty. However, soon after the angels entered Lot's home, the situation took a dark turn. According to Genesis 19 verses 4-5, before they had gone to bed, all the men from every part of the city of Sodom, both young and old, surrounded the house. They called to Lot, "Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us so that we can have relations with them." The behavior displayed by the crowd was not simply an issue of personal vice, but a demonstration of the deep moral decay that had taken root in Sodom. The townspeople had become so entrenched in their ways that they no longer respected the sanctity of hospitality, a value that was deeply revered in ancient societies. Lot, in an attempt to protect his guests, pleaded with the crowd, trying to reason with them. However, the situation escalated, and the angels intervened to protect Lot and his household. The Bible recounts that the angels struck the men outside with blindness, allowing Lot and his family a brief moment of safety. Genesis 19 verses 10-11 describes the scene. But the men inside reached out and pulled Lot back into the house and shut the door. Then they struck the men who were at the door of the house, young and old, with blindness so that they could not find the door. This intervention showed that, despite the rampant wickedness in Sodom, there was still divine mercy extended to those who sought to do good. The angels then gave a final warning to Lot and his family, urging them to leave the city immediately. Flee for your lives. Don't look back, and don't stop anywhere in the plain. Flee to the mountains, or you will be swept away. Genesis 19 verse 17. The urgency of their warning underscores the severity of the situation. Sodom and Gomorrah had reached a point where their sins had become so pervasive that the only solution was total destruction to prevent further harm. In the morning, as Lot and his family fled, fire and sulfur rained down from the heavens, completely consuming Sodom and Gomorrah. The destruction was so complete that nothing remained of the once thriving cities. The Bible captures the scene in Genesis 19 verses 24-25. Then the Lord rained down burning sulfur on Sodom and Gomorrah from the Lord out of the heavens. Thus he overthrew those cities and the entire plain, destroying all those living in the cities, and also the vegetation in the land. The obliteration of Sodom and Gomorrah was a powerful statement against the unchecked wickedness that had taken hold of the people. It was a response to the collective suffering caused by their actions, leaving nothing behind as a testament to their sins. In summary, the first sin that led to the downfall of these cities was their complete embrace of wickedness and violence, where even the most basic principles of hospitality, kindness, and respect for others were utterly abandoned. The story serves as a stark reminder of the consequences when a society loses its moral compass and disregards the well-being of its people. Now that we have explored the first sin, we move on to uncover the second transgression that contributed to the downfall of these cities, idolatry and the worship of false gods, which we will delve into in the next section. 2.2. Idolatry and materialism. The second sin that sealed the fate of Sodom and Gomorrah was their descent into idolatry and the worship of material wealth. While the cities were known for their prosperity and abundance, their inhabitants chose to turn away from God and instead devoted themselves to worshipping false idols and indulging in earthly pleasures. This led to a complete spiritual decay, where the values of righteousness, compassion, and humility were overshadowed by the pursuit of power, prestige, and material gain. The Bible provides insight into this sin in Romans 1 verse 25, where it describes the consequences of turning away from God. They exchanged the truth about God for a lie, and worshipped and served created things rather than the Creator, who is forever praised. Amen. This passage highlights how the people of Sodom and Gomorrah had abandoned their faith in the one true God, opting instead to place their trust in the things of this world, wealth, status, and physical gratification. The story of Sodom and Gomorrah may not explicitly detail the forms of idolatry practiced, but we can infer from the overall narrative that their hearts were far from God. The people were more concerned with their own desires and comforts, allowing their material wealth to replace their devotion to the Creator. This turning away from God led them to disregard the commandments that called for justice, mercy, and humility. The pursuit of material wealth became the central focus of their lives, leading to the erosion of their moral foundations. Instead of using their prosperity to help those in need or to uplift the community, they hoarded their riches and ignored the suffering around them. The prophet Ezekiel gives us a glimpse into their state of mind when he describes their arrogance and neglect. "Behold, this was the guilt of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters had pride, excess of food, and prosperous ease, but did not aid the poor and needy." Ezekiel 16 verse 49. This verse illustrates that despite having an abundance of resources, the people of Sodom refused to use their blessings to serve others. Their self-indulgence blinded them to the needs of the vulnerable, further deepening their separation from God. Idolatry, in the biblical sense, is not limited to the worship of carved images or false gods, but extends to anything that takes precedence over God in one's life. In the case of Sodom and Gomorrah, their obsession with material wealth and earthly pleasures became their downfall. By prioritizing these things, they lost sight of what truly mattered: faith, compassion, and obedience to God's will. Their focus on self-gratification and their disregard for spiritual values created a society where greed, selfishness, and corruption thrived. This pervasive attitude led to a collective moral blindness, where the people were no longer capable of recognizing the gravity of their sins. Their hearts had become hardened, and they had replaced the worship of God with the pursuit of their own desires. The worship of material wealth and power was not just a personal failing, but a societal one, where the entire community had turned away from God. The people of Sodom and Gomorrah exemplified a culture that glorified excess while neglecting the virtues of generosity and humility. This led to their eventual downfall, as they were unable to see that their idolatry was not only offensive to God, but was also destroying the moral fabric of their society. As we move forward, the story of Sodom and Gomorrah serves as a cautionary tale against the dangers of placing material wealth and worldly pursuits above spiritual values. The next sin we will explore reveals another dimension of their moral decline: sexual immorality, which contributed significantly to their ultimate destruction. Let's continue to uncover the third sin that led to the downfall of these ancient cities and see how it further sealed their fate. 2.3. Sexual immorality. The third sin that brought about the downfall of Sodom and Gomorrah was sexual immorality. This sin was not just a matter of personal failing, but had become a way of life for the people in these cities. The moral boundaries that once defined right and wrong had been completely abandoned, leading to a culture where perverse desires were openly pursued without regard for decency or respect for others. The Bible references this sin explicitly in several passages, showing that it was one of the core reasons why God decided to bring about the destruction of these cities. In the book of Jude, it is written, "Just as Sodom and Gomorrah and the surrounding cities, which likewise indulged in sexual immorality and pursued unnatural desire, serve as an example by undergoing a punishment of eternal fire." Jude 1 verse 7. This verse highlights that their actions were not isolated incidents but represented a deeply ingrained culture of indulgence in sinful behaviors that were far removed from God's commandments. The events described in Genesis 19 provide a vivid illustration of the extent of their moral corruption. When the two angels, disguised as travelers, arrived in Sodom, Lot welcomed them into his home, hoping to protect them from the dangers of the city. However, that very night, the men of Sodom surrounded Lot's house, demanding to be given access to his guests for their own perverse desires. Before they had gone to bed, all the men from every part of the city of Sodom, both young and old, surrounded the house. They called to Lot, "Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us so that we can have sex with them." Genesis 19 verses 4-5. This demand was not simply a desire for sexual relations but a display of power and domination. The inhabitants of Sodom sought to use violence and coercion to satisfy their lusts, disregarding any sense of morality or hospitality. The people's actions were not just a rejection of God's moral law, but also an assault on the dignity and sanctity of human life. Sexual immorality, in the context of Sodom and Gomorrah, went beyond private sins. It had become a public spectacle, a norm that was widely accepted and practiced. This moral decay had reached such a level that it was impossible to find even a handful of righteous individuals in the entire city, as seen in Abraham's plea with God in Genesis 18. What if only 10 righteous people can be found there? Will you still destroy the city? And God replied, "For the sake of 10, I will not destroy it." Genesis 18 verse 32. Yet, not even 10 righteous individuals could be found. Apostle Paul also speaks to the issue of sexual immorality when describing societies that have turned away from God. In Romans 1 verses 26-27, Paul writes, "Because of this, God gave them over to shameful lusts. Even their women exchanged natural sexual relations for unnatural ones. In the same way, the men also abandoned natural relations with women and were inflamed with lust for one another. Men committed shameful acts with other men, and received in themselves the due penalty for their error." This passage emphasizes that when a society rejects God's guidance, it becomes consumed by desires that lead to its own downfall. The people of Sodom and Gomorrah were living in such a state, where their actions were not just tolerated, but celebrated, leading to an irreversible decline in moral values. The consequences of their actions were catastrophic. God's judgment was swift and decisive, not only to punish, but also to prevent their corruption from spreading further. The fire and sulfur that rained down from heaven served as both a physical and symbolic cleansing, erasing the cities that had become synonymous with sin. In summary, the third sin that led to the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah was sexual immorality, a sin that permeated every level of their society. This behavior was not just a personal failing, but a collective descent into moral chaos. It was a rejection of God's design for human relationships and a flagrant disregard for the sanctity of life. In the next section, we will explore the fourth sin that contributed to the downfall of these cities: idleness and the neglect of the needy, which played a crucial role in sealing their fate. Let's continue our journey into understanding the full scope of their transgressions. 2.4 Idleness and neglect of the poor. The fourth sin that contributed to the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah was their idleness and disregard for the needy. Although these cities were blessed with abundance, prosperity, and comfort, the people became self-indulgent and apathetic, turning a blind eye to the needs of the less fortunate. Instead of using their wealth to do good, they allowed their affluence to make them complacent, arrogant, and selfish. The prophet Ezekiel offers a clear condemnation of Sodom's behavior in Ezekiel 16 verses 49-50, where he reveals the deeper moral failures beyond the commonly known sins. "Now this was the sin of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters were arrogant, overfed, and unconcerned. They did not help the poor and needy. They were haughty and did detestable things before me. Therefore, I did away with them as you have seen." This passage highlights that the downfall of Sodom was not solely due to acts of immorality, but also due to their refusal to act with compassion and mercy. They were consumed by their wealth, turning away from the principles of charity and kindness that God had commanded. While Sodom and Gomorrah were prosperous, their hearts became hardened. They grew accustomed to their luxuries and began to believe that their success was due to their own efforts, ignoring their responsibility to care for others. The abundance of resources led to a culture of idleness, where people pursued leisure and excess rather than meaningful work or acts of service. The Bible often warns against the dangers of idleness, which can lead to moral decay. In this case, the people of Sodom used their free time not for good deeds, but for self-indulgence and sinful pursuits. Their failure to extend a helping hand to the poor and oppressed was a direct violation of God's command to love one's neighbor. Instead of using their blessings to uplift those who were struggling, they chose to hoard their resources for themselves, becoming increasingly detached from the values of generosity and empathy. The consequences of this neglect were severe. In the biblical worldview, a society that neglects the needy and ignores the suffering of others is one that has lost its moral compass. Sodom and Gomorrah had become places where indifference to suffering was the norm. Their comfortable lives had led them to forget the divine principle that true wealth is measured not by material possessions, but by the love and care extended to others. In stark contrast to cities like Jerusalem or Bethlehem, which were known for their spiritual significance and acts of compassion, Sodom and Gomorrah were characterized by their self-centeredness. They failed to recognize that with great blessings comes the responsibility to care for those less fortunate. Instead, their arrogance and pride blinded them to the plight of the vulnerable around them. This sin of idleness and neglect was a clear sign that the cities had strayed far from God's teachings. Their refusal to assist the poor and their lack of concern for the suffering around them were offenses that God could not ignore. The complacency that came with their wealth ultimately contributed to their downfall, as it was a reflection of a society that had lost its moral and spiritual way. As the cities continued to indulge in their luxurious lifestyles, they became ever more detached from the principles of justice, mercy, and humility that God values. This indifference to others' needs was one of the final straws that led to God's judgment. By ignoring the cries of the poor, the cities demonstrated that their hearts had become calloused, and they were no longer capable of repentance. In conclusion, the fourth sin that sealed the fate of Sodom and Gomorrah was their idleness and neglect of the poor. In their arrogance, they forgot that prosperity is a gift meant to be shared, not hoarded. Their selfishness and refusal to help those in need were significant factors that led to their ultimate destruction. Next, we will explore the fifth and final sin that contributed to the annihilation of these cities: pride and open defiance against God. Let's delve deeper into how their arrogance played a crucial role in their downfall. 2.5. Pride and open defiance against God. The fifth and final sin that led to the downfall of Sodom and Gomorrah was pride, not just any pride, but an arrogant defiance against God. This sin was not merely about self-importance, it was a conscious and blatant rejection of divine guidance. The people of these cities had become so self-assured in their ways that they believed they were above God's laws, flaunting their sinful behaviors without remorse. In Isaiah 3 verses 8 to 9, the prophet describes the prideful nature of those who lived in defiance of God's will. For Jerusalem has stumbled, and Judah has fallen, because their speech and their deeds are against the Lord, defying His glorious presence. The look on their faces testifies against them. They proclaim their sin like Sodom, they do not hide it. Woe to them! For they have brought disaster upon themselves. This passage highlights that, like the people of Sodom, those who openly embrace sin with pride bring destruction upon themselves. The citizens of Sodom and Gomorrah were not just sinners, they were unapologetic about their transgressions, going so far as to take pride in their wickedness. This defiance was vividly demonstrated in their interactions with Lot, as recounted in Genesis 19. When the angels arrived to investigate the city, the people surrounded Lot's house, demanding access to his guests. This was more than just a show of force, it was a deliberate challenge to God's messengers. By attempting to violate the sacred duty of hospitality and assaulting divine messengers, they were not just rejecting human decency, but were actively rebelling against God's authority. Their pride went beyond immoral actions, it extended to a complete disregard for any form of accountability. The people of Sodom and Gomorrah were not ashamed of their actions, they paraded their sins openly, as if daring God to respond. This kind of pride is particularly dangerous because it reflects a hardened heart, one that is incapable of repentance or humility. The Bible teaches that pride is often the root of other sins, leading individuals and even entire societies down a path of destruction. Proverbs 16 verse 18 warns, "Pride goes before destruction, a haughty spirit before a fall." The pride of Sodom and Gomorrah was a direct challenge to God's sovereignty. By living in such open rebellion, they essentially invited judgment upon themselves, sealing their fate. In the case of these cities, their pride manifested in multiple ways: their disregard for justice, their indulgence in excess, their refusal to help the needy, and their shameless pursuit of immoral desires. But it was their defiant attitude toward God that ultimately led to their annihilation. The fire and brimstone that rained down upon them were not just a punishment for their actions, but a response to their persistent and unrepentant defiance. In the final moments before the destruction, Lot and his family were warned to flee without looking back. However, Lot's wife, overcome by attachment to the life she was leaving behind, looked back and was turned into a pillar of salt. Genesis 19 verse 26. This act symbolized the danger of clinging to a life steeped in sin and pride. The story serves as a poignant reminder that pride not only blinds individuals to their own faults, but also leads them away from the path of salvation. The obliteration of Sodom and Gomorrah was a clear message that God will not tolerate prideful defiance. The people of these cities had every opportunity to turn back, to repent, to seek mercy, but their hearts were too hardened, their pride too great. In the end, their refusal to humble themselves before God led to their complete destruction. As we conclude our exploration of the 5 sins of Sodom and Gomorrah, it becomes clear that their downfall was not due to a single transgression, but a culmination of wickedness, immorality, selfishness, and pride. These sins were not just individual failings, but were embedded in the very fabric of their society. The story of these cities serves as a timeless warning of the consequences of turning away from God's laws and embracing a life of sin without remorse. Thank you for joining us in this deep dive into one of the most profound stories of judgment in the Bible. The tale of Sodom and Gomorrah is not merely a historical account, but a call for reflection on the state of our own hearts and societies. May we learn from their example and strive to live lives rooted in humility, compassion, and faithfulness. Part 3: Reflection and Lessons from the Destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. After exploring the 5 unforgivable sins that led to the complete destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, it's time to reflect on the profound lessons this biblical story holds for us today. The story is not just an ancient tale of divine judgment, but a timeless reminder of the consequences of moral decay, selfishness, and defiance against God. As we conclude this exploration, let's delve into what we can learn from the fate of these infamous cities and how these lessons are still relevant in our modern world. 3.1. The consequences of a society without moral boundaries. The downfall of Sodom and Gomorrah was not a sudden event. It was the result of years of unchecked wickedness, violence, and immorality. The story teaches us that when a society loses its moral compass, the results can be catastrophic. The people of these cities became so accustomed to their sinful ways that they no longer saw anything wrong with their actions. This normalization of sin ultimately led to their complete destruction. In today's world, where societal norms are constantly shifting, the story of Sodom and Gomorrah serves as a powerful reminder of the dangers of moral relativism. When a community collectively rejects the principles of justice, compassion, and respect for others, it risks falling into the same pattern of decay that led to the demise of these ancient cities. 3.2. The importance of compassion and helping the needy. One of the most striking elements of the story is the stark contrast between the hospitality of Lot and the cruelty of the people of Sodom. Despite living in a corrupt society, Lot chose to honor the sacred duty of welcoming strangers, a value deeply respected in biblical times. However, the rest of the city's inhabitants were so consumed by selfishness and pride that they refused to help those in need. Ezekiel 16 verse 49 highlights this sin clearly. They were arrogant, overfed, and unconcerned. They did not help the poor and needy. This serves as a warning for us to never become indifferent to the suffering of others. In a world where the gap between the rich and the poor continues to widen, we are reminded of our responsibility to use our resources not just for personal gain, but to uplift those who are struggling. 3.3. The dangers of pride and defiance against God. The ultimate downfall of Sodom and Gomorrah was their unrepentant pride. Even as they faced destruction, the people of these cities were defiant, refusing to acknowledge their wrongdoing or seek forgiveness. This kind of arrogance is a clear warning that pride can blind individuals and entire societies to the point where they are incapable of recognizing their own faults. In our modern world, where self-promotion and the pursuit of status have become cultural norms, the story urges us to reflect on the dangers of excessive pride. True wisdom lies in humility and the willingness to change course when we are on the wrong path. 3.4. The call for personal reflection and repentance. The story of Sodom and Gomorrah is not just about the sins of a distant society, but serves as a call for each of us to examine our own lives. Are we, too, guilty of placing material wealth, personal desires, or social status above the values of compassion, humility, and obedience to God? Are there areas in our lives where we have become complacent, indifferent, or even proud of behaviors that go against our moral beliefs? In Genesis 18, Abraham's dialogue with God reveals that even a small number of righteous people could have saved the cities. This highlights the power of individual righteousness and the impact it can have on an entire community. It is a reminder that our actions, no matter how small, can make a difference. By choosing to live with integrity, kindness, and faith, we can be the light in a world that sometimes feels overshadowed by darkness. 3.5. The hope for redemption and God's mercy. While the story of Sodom and Gomorrah ends in destruction, it also carries a message of hope. Lot and his family were saved because of their willingness to follow God's guidance. This shows that even in the midst of widespread wickedness, God is willing to extend mercy to those who seek Him. The story reminds us that it's never too late to turn back to God, to seek forgiveness, and to live a life aligned with His will. In our world today, where it's easy to feel overwhelmed by negativity and despair, the story encourages us to remain steadfast in our faith. No matter how far we may have strayed, there is always a path to redemption if we are willing to humble ourselves, repent, and seek God's guidance. The story of Sodom and Gomorrah is more than just a tale of ancient judgment. It is a mirror reflecting the potential consequences of living a life devoid of moral and spiritual values. It challenges us to consider the direction in which we, as individuals and as a society, are heading. Are we moving towards compassion, kindness, and righteousness, or are we falling into the same traps of selfishness, pride, and indifference that led to the destruction of these cities? Let this story serve as both a cautionary tale and an inspiration, a call to live with integrity, to seek justice, and to prioritize the well-being of others above our own desires. By embracing the values that Sodom and Gomorrah rejected, we can avoid their fate and create a society rooted in love, compassion, and faith. Thank you for joining us in this exploration of one of the Bible's most powerful stories. We hope it has inspired you to reflect on your own life and the values that guide you. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more insightful content. May you walk in faith and live a life that honors God's teachings.